introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself, and we can give these people the show they came for.
Okay, sure. My name is Ira Naiman. I am a comedy writer and specifically a satirist, which of course is a political form of humor, very political form of humor. So I've been doing that since I was 8 years old. So I've been doing it for decades. I have 8 novels published by Elsewhen Press, and Les Pages Folles, my website of political and social satire, will be 20 next month. That's 20 years of weekly updates. That's a lot of comedy writing. So you can understand why I have a particular interest in the nature of politics in fiction.
Okay, well, I'm Stephen B. Pearl. B makes it easy to find me on the internet. And I'm a science fiction, fantasy, modern fantasy writer. And basically, my claim to fame for this panel is my Tinker's World series, which is a realistic extrapolation of where we'll be in about 200 years' time if we don't do something to fix the mess we're making now. So, a lot of environmental tech, a lot of environmental commentary, but mostly a I consider a rollicking good adventure story that you could actually see happening. The panel is, I will just do that for due diligence, the role of speculative fiction and RPG in education and warning. When writing fiction, one can play what if and see how the dominoes fall. And as such, can speculative fiction serve the function of being a canary in a coal mine for society? And if it can, who will listen?
So, well, when I was contemplating this this subject, 2 novels came to mind. One which has been much commented on recently, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Mm-hmm. And you can see with the reversal of Roe v. Wade in the United States Supreme Court, and all of the Republican states scrambling to see who can be the most repressive in terms of women's rights, you can actually see the beginnings of the kind of dystopian future that Atwood had created. And like I say, a lot of people have commented on that. One that I think is sometimes overlooked in our current politics, but which still speaks today, I think, is George Orwell's 1984. Mm-hmm. When I think, for instance, of how, and again, this is largely in relation to American politics, although Canada is by no means immune, but when I think of the concept of newspeak, how words mean what we want them to mean and not, have a set definition. That's very much the Republican playbook. Doublethink, where you hold 2 contradictory ideas at the same time. I think, for instance, of the far-right Christians who, on the one hand, espouse to be Christians, but on the other hand, are quite happy supporting Donald Trump, who is a bigamist, serial liar, who seems so much against what they profess to believe in. And they can hold these 2 things at the same time, these 2 ideas. But to me, the really sort of fundamental concept from 1984 is the memory hole. Now, you may recall, or for those of you who aren't familiar with 1984, the main character, Winston Smith, his job is to edit newspapers. And his job specifically is that when somebody who used to be in favor with the ruling party becomes out of favor with the ruling party, he literally goes in and cuts out their images from photos. He cuts out any mention of them from text. It's as if they never existed. And when somebody in Donald Trump's orbit is arrested for doing bad things, And Donald Trump says, oh yeah, I barely knew the guy. Am I pronouncing his name right? I don't know what. It's very clear that he's memory holding people who used to be his supporters, to the point where, you know, he's quite happy with the rioters on 1/6 hanging Mike Pence, his uber loyal vice president. But because he didn't do one thing that Trump wanted him to do, he was gone. So I think those two novels speak to our moment. Now, I would have to warn that it's not quite so simple as, you know, an author seeing what's coming. Margaret Atwood has said very specifically that her inspiration for The Handmaid's Tale was how women's rights were repressed in Iran. She was not writing about contemporary United States, but she was writing about a contemporary country. In a similar vein, Orwell was not writing about the United States. For one thing, Oceania is probably a vision of England, not the US. But his inspiration was the repression of communist Russia, right? So he wasn't writing about the United States either. I think there is a sense, and the reason that they both write these novels in the first place is a warning, hey, you know, this could happen here if we're not careful, right? So I do think that there is a sense that maybe it was intentional, right? But, you know, as I point out to people, Margaret Atwood could never have imagined that somebody like Mitch McConnell would be able to stack the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, right? These are details about how we got to this place that she could not have imagined. At the same time, you know, Orwell couldn't have imagined that a Stalin-esque figure like Donald Trump could become the president of the United States. These are details that are not something that an author can predict. So we have to be careful about the predictive power of fiction, because I'm not 100% sure it's there. And that's me talking a lot. So Stephen, maybe you want to add some more to that.
Well, I will add a little bit to the George Orwell, the Orwellian newspeak, because yes, the right is effectively doing Orwellian newspeak, but so is the left. And the whole point of Orwellian newspeak was that you would remove the language enough that you could not even discuss unpopular, unsanctioned areas of the human experience. And I look at the whole political correct movement. Now, there are some words that have always been, will always be uncouth. They mark the people who use them as low and reprehensible. But I've always had the standard that proper dictionary English must be the fallback from political correctness. And it's gotten to the point where you can't say things in proper dictionary English without being attacked. And we see this happening time and time again on social media. And it also comes to a point where eventually take a chill pill. And you have a lot of people who are using this newspeak thing. Oh, you offended me. Why? I said that somebody, you know, I've had the situation of saying that somebody was being uppity, as in you're behaving like an uppity child. And they purposefully, because they did not like being told that their behavior was unacceptable, tried to take it as a racial slur. And it has gotten absolutely ridiculous. Um, yes, you have, well, I think, I don't know if Orwell said it himself, but many people have said about Orwell's work that he wasn't writing an instruction manual. It was a cautionary tale. And in my own work, in Tinker's Sea, my concerns tend to be more environmental because, frankly, humans are going to mess up their own societies. Then they'll kill a whole bunch of people. It'll reach the boiling point. A whole bunch of people will die. And then it will go back to something more moderate. And the cycle will repeat because the cycle has gone on from time immemorial. If you look at the ancient Egyptians, if Queen Hatshepsut, I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly, when she died, her nephew who had who took the throne after her, removed all mention of her, and basically they re-chiseled rock to remove her name. Put down.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? As Orwell pointed out, and I think we're seeing this play out again in the States. When you control history, when you control what people can read about history and what people understand about history, you very much control the things that they're going to do in the present and moving forward into the future, because our actions are based on an understanding of what the problems used to be and how we can solve them. I also think, I think you are part, the Tinker's Plague series certainly is part of an important wave of science fiction that's sometimes called solar punk. But a lot of people now are really dealing with what is now the inescapable reality of climate change and how bad things are going to get before they get better.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the interesting things that happened in Tinker's Sea, I had them put a nuclear waste dump on the shoreline of Lake Huron. I did it for dramatic effect. I did it because that was necessary for my plot line. And even I thought, I'm really kind of pushing it. Nobody's that stupid. Then, shortly after the book was published, they came out with a plan to put a nuclear waste dump on the shoreline of Lake Huron, within about 10 kilometers of where I put mine in my fiction. That was supposed to be cautionary. In The Light Between Stars, which is an anthology available through Brainlag Publishing, I have Tinker's Toxin, my contribution to that, where there's a illegal toxic waste dump that gets eroded out and starts poisoning a river and the surrounding area. We've already had this happen. And with the removal of inspectors and the eroding away of the Inland Waters Act, which the Conservatives gutted and the Liberals have not restored. And that reduced the protections of our water and our environment substantially. We have, we're still dumping mass amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. And basically, it is going to get worse before it gets better. I do not mind saying.
We know that, and we know it's going to get worse for the people who can deal with it the most, deal with it the least, rather. You're already seeing droughts in part of the world where food scarcity was already a problem, and this is just making starvation and things like that go through the roof. I just wanted to mention that we have some very interesting comments in the chat. If people have questions at any time, please put them in the chat and we will get to them as soon as we can. Also, if you have sources, if you have political work that you'd like us to discuss, throw those suggestions into the chat as well. I think that Signata makes a good point. It's, to a large extent, it really depends on the author's intent, right? And we were actually having a discussion around this subject in an earlier session, where it is okay to have characters say things that would offend people if the author, his or herself, makes it clear that this is not the author's intent, right? The author isn't the one who is trying to insult whatever the group is, right? Trying to offend whatever the group is. But realistically, if we want to portray, say, bigoted characters, they're going to have to talk like bigoted characters, which means they're going to say stuff that's going to potentially offend some readers, right? If we want to be realistic about portraying bad things, that has to be, we have to potentially offend some people. That just comes with the territory. But as I say, there are a lot of ways, and I don't mean that the writer has to, create arrows saying, this is bad, don't listen to this person is saying bad things. One of the first rules that I learned when I started writing satire a long time ago was that you never come out and directly say what you mean to say. It's always there, and it should be easy enough for a reader to interpret, but for the author to just come out and baldly say racism is bad or whatever their point of view is just bad writing.
Yeah,
right.
Well, it comes to show, don't tell.
Yeah, exactly. But there are ways of showing how the author feels. We were talking, for instance, about All in the Family, which is a TV series, which was a TV series that was built around a white working class bigot, right? And one of the things I pointed out was that almost all of the other characters on the show fought with him constantly about his political views. And, this was a way of Norman Lear, who was well known for his liberal leanings, to be able to show, no, I don't approve of this, what this character is saying. The interesting thing about that, and there are studies that have shown this actually, is that how you viewed the character of Archie Bunker was really determined by what your politics were going into the show. Liberals, people who tended to identify as liberals, tended to see him as a satire of right-wing bigotry. People who saw themselves as conservatives, people who identified as conservatives, thought he was actually a sympathetic portrayal of a working class person who just happened to have to be funny because the show had to be a comedy. And that's, it's interesting because as I've often said, anything that can be interpreted or that you have to interpret to get the author's meaning can be misinterpreted. So when you're writing about political themes, when you're writing on political ideas, you have to be very clear and focused on exactly what you are saying and how you are saying it, to make sure that to the best of your ability, your point is going to land.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. You have to. It's dark and light. You can't have light without darkness. There's not. You have to have the spectrum represented, and as long as the reprehensible character is shown ultimately to be reprehensible, then it's a reasonable portrayal. In Tinker's Plague, I start off, one of the first characters you meet is a abusive, narrow-minded wife beater who does not believe in science, and he is juxtaposed against the Tinker, who is sort of as close to the shining example of what is good and right as far as I'm concerned, as you can get. But also, you don't want to run the risk. Well, we're getting a little off topic. I'll just say you don't want to run the risk of making anyone too perfect, because we all have flaws and our characters should have flaws. Now, using this to do cautionary tales about what's upcoming. Yes, The Handmaid's Tale is an excellent cautionary tale. And I didn't know that she based it on Islam, on Middle Eastern, a Middle Eastern nation. But it makes a lot of sense that that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
1984 is basically, he wanted initially to call it 1948. And I actually wrote an essay for 1984 in the 21st century, which one of the big scary things I find with 1984 is the type of surveillance that he postulated was, until recently, effectively impossible. It would have been too cost prohibitive. Now, they've actually got the common citizen paying for it by everybody having a cell phone. And every cell phone has a GPS tracker. So if you have your phone on you, they can track you anywhere.
The surveillance potential of our current technologies is just astonishing.
Yeah.
I'll give you one example, because this is a really weird example, but it goes back to Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. There is software now that will help women track their periods. And the reason why women might want this is because if they want children, it's good to know when they are at their most fertile, right? But states that are outlawing abortion can get a woman's history from this and know, for instance, that if a woman has missed 2 or 3 periods, there is a very good possibility that she was pregnant and terminated it before it became due, which means that the state can actually use this information against women, right? It's the possibility for surveillance is built into so much of what we do. Sales on Amazon is another great example, right? Everything you buy, every credit card purchase you make.
Well, you look at the new Battlestar Galactica, and the computer systems basically were generating artificial cyber personalities of people who had lived by compiling the data. And we are getting to that point where, yeah, you can get a really complete picture of somebody. You use your credit card, it goes through a computer. The Hamilton police force in Ancaster was running a program where they wanted to network individual security cams so that they could have better track criminal activity. We are in effect paying for our own subjugation.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah, two things in the chat. Black Mirror is excellent for prognosticating near future disasters. It's a brilliant series. And I was also going to bring up Person of Interest, which is very much about the surveillance state and scary, and just how close it is to being a reality.
mm-hmm.
Sorry, Stephen, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, that's okay. But, you know, future prognostication, I can't remember. It was, I think, 10 seconds after. It might have been 3 seconds after. But it was a story of an electromagnetic pulse set off in over the continental United States, and one community trying to cope with the aftermath. And the book itself, not bad. The concept, really, people should understand it. We have circuit boards in everything now. AM pulse, your car won't start. EM pulse, your washing machine won't work. EM pulse, the pumping station won't work. And that was something that, again, I keep going back to my own work because I know it better than anything else. But in the prelude to the Tinker series, there's an EM pulse, and it's the last straw that causes effectively a new dark ages. And over a 5-year period, about 90% of the world population dies, mostly from waterborne disease, because we already have a situation where we have no resistance, particularly in the West, to waterborne pathogens. This is a good thing. We've more or less eliminated them. You take away the huge amount of energy we use to clean our water, all of those are going to resurge. And it's, we don't look at it. And there are many places where, frankly, analog technology is superior to the more modern computer technology. I don't need to control my washing machine from my phone. But if my washing machine breaks down, I would rather replace a $20 analog unit than have to buy a new motherboard for $250. Caution. This is something fiction can do and needs to do, because fiction looks ahead. And as it says in the write-up for this, you have the burden of proof removed. So you can play what if. You can extrapolate the logical consequence. And then others can pick it up and say, you know, that could happen. How can we prevent it? Which is the most important thing. You know, it's not an instruction manual. It's a warning. And
not always an accurate warning either. Although the jury is still out and it's still possible, we do, in the 1950s and 60s, we had a lot of science fiction around nuclear war. I think of Neville Shoots on the Beach, or stories like that. And thankfully, or even my favorite, Dr. Strangelove, thankfully those scenarios did not come to pass. That's the thing about what ifs. If the conditions are right, then you get a Handmaid's Tale or a 1984, which speaks to, yes, which speaks to the current moment in politics. But if the conditions are not right, then, well, then it's an open question, right? I mean, did we avoid a nuclear war because we were inherently smart enough to avoid it? Or did we avoid it because all of the dystopian post-narrative war stories really scared the bejesus out of us to the point where we wanted to make sure it didn't happen? It's theoretically possible, I guess, that that dystopian future didn't come to pass specifically because of the fiction. I'm kind of iffy, I don't know, but I have to acknowledge that it's at least possible.
I think it's a combination of factors. Nobody's going to read a fictional book and suddenly have an epiphany. I think it's drops of water behind a dam. You know, you put one drop, you put another drop, you put another drop, another drop, and then you fill up the reservoir. I think that fiction can play that role. Also, the great advantage of fiction is people don't go in with a lot of preconceptions. When you put a factual book in front of somebody, as they're reading it, they're arguing against the points that they don't like. You put a fiction book in front of somebody, it's just different enough that it slips past their preconceptions. They read it, and then by the time they realize that they've had information imparted, they've had a persuasive argument given, it's already gotten by. They've listened. This is why a lot of racial issues get shifted from racism to aliens in science fiction. Enemy Mine is a great example.
Yeah. Oh, that's the trick I tried to pull with the trilogy that I've just finished. It's about a race of aliens from another universe, actually. Their universe is collapsing, and so the Transdimensional Authority, which is my group that polices traffic between dimensions, gets this grand idea that it's going to save as many of those aliens as possible by transporting them, helping them emigrate into stable dimensions. And they interact with human beings and with other alien species eventually, but with human beings specifically, in ways both positive and negative. That to me, that the trilogy is very much about the human immigration experience, but translated into aliens in part because I thought it would be an easier pill for people to swallow rather than, humanoid creatures, but also because the story of immigration is almost universal. And if there were humanoids in my story, then people could say, oh, well, that's just Blacks, or that's just Jews, or that's just a specific immigration experience. By using a species that doesn't actually exist in this world, it invited all different kinds of people from all different backgrounds to try and see what I was saying as it related to their family's immigrant experience. Mouse was amazing. It was very good for that. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Sorry. I should also mention we've only got about 15 minutes left. I assume these run in 50-minute intervals. So if anybody wants to ask any questions, now would be a good time to do it.
It's a soft 50 minutes. It's actually booked. Zoom does by the hour, so.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, well, it's like I said in the discussion we had earlier, human nature is such that you always have somebody wanting to point a finger and say, they are the source of your problem. They are the other. And you don't have to take responsibility for yourself because they did it. And that's a very attractive thing because it absolves you of responsibility. And this is something that can be addressed in fiction. I do it in my cloning, in my Freedom Saga, cloning. Yes, I'm coming back to my own. Cloning Freedom, Freedom's Law, Freedom's Myth, coming out this December. I have a human society that has moved past racism, moved past sexual phobia, and they've now found a new group to hate: clones. And clones have no rights. And they even have a war that they can blame in everything the clones on and say, it's because the clones have no souls. And they recycle all the old slavery arguments.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I should mention, Stephen mentioned this, but I really think it's an important point. I've read the Tinker's Plague books, and I'm a big fan. And they are not in any way didactic. Okay, they are rollicking good stories. They're good guys and bad guys, and they're problems that need to be overcome. And I think that's kind of important for a couple of reasons, partially because, as Stephen said, it's going to make people much more open to the things he has to say about the environment. But also, it doesn't really matter if the particular future that Stephen posits comes to pass. People will still be reading these books because they're just enjoyable adventure stories, right? Well, I kind of hope they don't, because 90% of the population dying is a pretty horrible thing to consider. But even if they don't come to pass, these stories will always have value as stories.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing I do want to stress. I believe the first responsibility of fiction is to entertain.
Yes.
And you can talk about the entertainment value of fiction, but also if it can educate at the same time, that's all for the good. But if it fails to entertain, it's failed as fiction.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I have a very specific goal as a fiction writer because I write comedy. The reader has to be laughing. If the reader isn't laughing, it doesn't matter if they got the point of what I was trying to say. It fails as fiction. Absolutely.
Yeah, and any science fiction is, well, any futuristic science fiction is postulating forward. I haven't seen the last of the Jurassic Park movies yet, but Jurassic Park was near future science fiction. And it's gone a little off the rails, but it was, Crichton's initial books were very thoughtful and very much, no, we have to address the concept of genetic power. Do we ignore it, which is foolish because the potential good from the technology is overwhelming. But we also have to be careful. My problem with GMOs is not, genetically modified organisms like crops and so forth, is not the creation of them. It's the lack of oversight on them. It's the fact that they rush to market before they've done adequate testing to see how it will integrate with the environment in general. Uh,
Well, as part of my personal background, I have a PhD in communications, and I've studied the history of communication systems in particular, but technologies in general. And one of the things I always caution people is that um, new technologies are always double-edged swords. The question is whether we are going to use them to the fullest of their positive potential or to the fullest of their negative potential. And
mhm.
that is really a reflection on who we are and not usually the technologies themselves. The only possible exceptions I would make are perhaps guns and nuclear bombs. Nuclear power has been a great boon to a lot of countries, but bombs themselves have no positive value as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well, we actually have something that ties into this in the chat. So far, we've discussed examples of things gone wrong. Do you think there's a role for stories of things gone right, i.e. a story set in the future scenario with tech built on renewables? And I will jump right on this because in my Tinker's World series, I have the Tinkers who are coming out from Nova Gale, one of the two remaining high-tech states, into the Darklands, areas without electricity, helping them bootstrap themselves back to energy abundance through the use of wind, solar, wave, biomass, all the sustainables. So yes, there are things gone right stories. And the problem is when a technology works, it becomes meshed into the background of life so thoroughly, it's hardly recognizable. We just take it for granted. Electricity, incredible technology, light at the flip of a switch, far more efficient than fire, oil, any of the combustibles, far safer. But when somebody sticks their finger in a light socket and fries themselves, that's what you read about. So it is kind of a weird thing that, yes, the technology is wonderful and it's positive and it gets woven, like in reality, into the background so thoroughly, you hardly see
it. And it also, I mean, when things go wrong, that's where you get conflict. Whereas when things go right, it's a lot harder to develop conflict. Although I will say, and again, as another part of my background, I was the editor of Amazing Stories magazine for 3 years. And we were specifically looking for hopeful stories of hopeful futures. We were looking for stories that that portrayed futures that we frankly would want to live in, as opposed to the nightmare futures that you see in so much science fiction these days. And after about a year of editing the magazine, I actually came across the term hope punk. So there is a whole sub-branch of science fiction literature now devoted to what can happen when things go right, trying to make the future look a lot more hopeful. And this is perhaps a cyclical thing. I know, you know, having talked about it a lot, that it is a manifestation of our culture, right? The principles in Amazing Stories, we all grew up in the 60s and 70s, when science fiction was, you know, the hopefulness of the Star Trek future. And then we kind of moved into dystopias in the 1980s. Dystopia was really big in the 1980s. And we kind of lost that. And so we were hoping to go back to a more hopeful kind of future. But again, the 60s were a hopeful time. The 80s, not so much. Now we see a lot of dystopia because, frankly, we're living in a dystopian world. Yep. The 80s had a lot of harshness for a lot of people, and it's getting worse now in the 2020s. And it wouldn't, like, you don't want to be hopeful in the face of horrible disaster. That seems naive. That doesn't seem realistic, right? If you want to portray a future that we could actually live in, that is hopeful, then you have to be able to give us at least some idea of how we get to there from where we are now, which is, the same idea as dystopias, which tell us, how we get to the horrible place from where we are now. So I guess that's not that much different, but yeah, that's me on Hope Punk. Check it out. It's like, part of it is just fun writing. I stopped reading dystopias after a while because it was just so dark and so much of a drag, frankly. And that's not, yeah, exactly. You don't want your positivity to be toxic. We're gonna smile no matter how bad things are. Yeah, but realistic, hopeful science fiction is certainly possible, and it's like I say, it's so much more fun to read.
Yeah, there has to be a journey. The journey can be from a very dark place. You can start off in any kind of fiction in a very dark place. And actually, sometimes that's the best thing you want to do for the warning, for the cautionary side of it. But you have to provide that ramp out of the darkness. There has to be a dawn. And that's the challenge, because you can get to a point, even in the real world, you can get to a point where you're turning around and you just don't see a path out. And every time you take a step, something seems to try to chop your foot off. Hello, 1980s. But you have to, in fiction, to hold the reader, you need to have that ramp. And you really need to look to hope and provide solutions. They may not be completely viable. That's for the engineers to work out. As a fiction writer, I see part of our job as to inspire. And to inspire, I often say, you write your technology and you know enough about it so that somebody who really knows about it will squint and say, well, if I do this and do that, maybe. And if you can accomplish that, you've done your job. Larry Niven, with his Ringworld, he had a situation where a group of scientists went through and actually ran the numbers on the Ringworld and came up to him and said, this could not work because, and started railing at it. So he wrote a whole book, I think it was called Ringworld Engineers, that dealt with their complaints. And he put it out. They took it, they read it, and then they came up to him and said, that couldn't work because, and Larry just went, I give up. It's a fiction book.
There you go. In chat, yeah. Caitlin has asked us, it seems like a lot of problems we face are cyclical. For example, The Handmaid's Tale being based on things that were happening in one location at a time, now resonating in another. How much do you draw on history and past events to shape your narratives? I'll go first, since I threw out the question. I, for the longest time, because I write on a weekly basis and I have to be very up to date on politics, I used to read like 2 newspapers, several magazines, and watched a lot of TV news every single day. Don't do that quite as much anymore, but but I still do a lot of research, and a lot of my writing is very much contemporary, very much about the moment, which is a problem with satire, but we can leave that for another time. In terms of my longer narrative fiction, the stories that I drew on for instance, my immigrant trilogy, were stories that go back in my family a few generations and probably resonate with other people's experience as well. It really, the amount of research, and the kind of research that I do really depends on the project that I'm working on.
Yeah, frankly, I'm constantly referencing back to history because of the cyclic nature of human affairs. Human beings don't change. We become more sophisticated, we get better tools, but in our basic behavior patterns, we are strategically shaped chimps. So you can look at the Roman Empire. Well, if you want to understand American history, what's going on in America today, read the Roman Empire. If you want to understand Trump, look at Nero. Some people say Caligula, but Caligula was a different kettle of fish. Nero was the megalomaniac who basically was an actor and beat his wife to death because she pointed out that he made a flaw in his performance. Made his horse a senator.
I would have compared Trump to Stalin. And the thing about the cyclical nature of history is, yeah, we're both kind of right? There are examples of Trump-like figures in any number of fallen empires.
Yeah, and all empires rise, peak, fall. Now, there are two models to the fall. One, they can accept gracefully that they are no longer the big kid in the schoolyard and easily come down, and there's less suffering for the population there. More or less saw that with the English Empire. Or you can deny it, keep saying you are the greatest, and then it all catches up with you and you crash and burn. And these are the two cycles that go through history. And in writing fiction, you can draw on that. And I'll point out, in Cloning Freedom, it's basically getting a clone out of the United Earth systems. I drew fairly heavily on the Underground Railroad from the American slave period, which ended in Canada because once they reached Canada, it was English territory, and by English law, slavery was abolished. I think a century or more before it was, but in the United States. And even in the northern states that did not allow slavery, if a slave was captured, they would be deported back to the southern states. And that went back and forth in their parliament several times. Well, I have a reading in 5 minutes. So let's, are there any last minute questions from the audience?
Putin's another good example. Yeah. If you enjoyed this panel, Stephen and I have panels all weekend, so look for us. If you're interested in my writing, I have a reading tomorrow at, I think, 6:15. So, you can search for me there. Thanks everybody for coming.
It was great having you guys. And drop by my reading. It's in 5 minutes or so. I'll be reading from Revenant, which is paranormal action adventure and a lot of fun. Bye-bye. Okay, end meeting for